All right, friends, wonderful to see you all again. I know that we have picked up new participants, and we are very pleased to have loyal participants, and we have a wonderful program that is brought to you by Chidush in partnership with Chidush, Rabbis and Cantors for Religious Freedom and Equality in Israel, J-Plan, the Jewish Pluralism Legal Action Network, and the American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists. We are very appreciative of having some of the leaders of our respective organizations with us, Stanley Gold and Bob Levine. Stanley chairs Chidush and Bob is our treasurer. Steve Greenwald, the president of the American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists, and quite a number of colleagues. Rabbi Rachel Yurevitz is a member of our executive committee of Chidush, and there are probably others that I have not picked up. I apologize. So today we are privileged to have now a young, you can see his face, I mean, he's young, a rising star in the field of Jewish thought, Professor Alex Kaye from the Israel Center at Brandeis University, who published this year at Oxford University Press a book on theocracy and the invention of Jewish theocracy. A great teacher, and sure enough, I asked him to talk about a topic which is as academically engaging and interesting as it is relevant to the current battles which Israel is confronting. You'll hear about it from him, so I won't attempt to introduce any of the essence of the topic. He'll speak about Jewish theocracy versus democracy and the relevance to Israel today. We are going to continue our series with alternating between rabbinics, law, both, and next webinar in 2 weeks from now, Professor Ruth Halperin-Kedari, who founded and heads the Reckman Center for Advancement of Women's Status at Bar-Ilan University Law School, will speak about women and COVID-19 pandemic, religion, law, state, and politics. And she is extremely qualified to speak about all of these. And what we have not announced in writing yet, but write it into your calendars, 2 weeks afterwards, we are having a fantastic panel speaking about modern orthodoxy in Israel and in the US, and basically is a revolution unfolding. And we'll have our own Rabbi Asher Lopatin of our executive committee, and Rabbi Daniel Landis, who's known to many of you. For many, many years, he headed Pardes, and Daphne Price, the executive director of JOFA, the Jewish Orthodox Feminist Alliance, and Rabbi Avram Melotek, another rising star, who is certainly a trailblazer in the field of modern orthodoxy. How radical, how revolutionary, you'll have to come and join us. So for today, Alex Kaye on Jewish theocracy versus democracy. And please, I'm reminding you to use the chat. If you wish to raise questions, I will monitor those questions and raise them with Alex. And also we are recording this webinar, and it'll be available after the session, probably in a day or so. Take it away, Alex.
Uli, thank you so much. And it's a tremendous pleasure to be able to present to everybody. I speak about, I research and therefore I lecture and teach a great deal about the history of religion and law and politics in Israel and in Jewish thought more generally. But it is a special pleasure to be able to talk about this work specifically with this group, with the collection of of activists in one of the most crucial, controversial, urgent areas in Israeli civil society, as well as with scholars, with practitioners of law, and all of you who are on the call. So thanks so much for being here today. I'm going to share the screen right now because I have some slides to show you. The talk that I'm giving today, I'm calling the invention of Jewish theocracy, and the reason for that is that it's the title of the book that I just published. Here is the front of the book. The reason I'm showing you the front of the book is, first of all, I'd love you to see it and to know about it. But I'm showing it you primarily because I'm interested in your focus on the cover art, the piece of art that I chose to begin the book with. And that is this picture here, which was an etching made by Moses Ephraim Lillian at the beginning of the 20th century. And it appears in a German translation of the Bible. And Lillian made the illustrations for it. And here, as you can see, it says underneath the picture Mose, in German, this is Moses, coming down from Sinai, or maybe at the top of Sinai still, and holding the tablets of the law. Now, Lillian was a German artist, and the style that he used was familiar to sort of young German artists at the time. This lots of artistic, naturalistic swirls, and you can see volcanoes and stars and these marvelous details. But the thing that I want to look at is Moses' face. And to anyone that knows anything about Zionist history, I think it's immediately apparent that Lillian chose to draw Moses with the face of Theodor Herzl. And the reason he did this was because Lillian was very active in the Zionist movement. A lot of his art actually appears in all kinds of Zionist contexts. And the reason I chose this image to start the book is because I think it encapsulates what is a fundamental ambiguity in the way that the Zionist movement as a whole understood the relationship between religion and the politics of the Zionist movement in general. We have here Moses, a biblical, essentially a religious figure, and Herzl, who was a secular Jewish, but very secular in his thinking political leader. So Moses and Herzl are essentially transposed onto each other. And the question at the heart of really the entire thread of Zionist history is, what is the nature of this transposition? What is the nature of the relationship between the image of Moses and the image of Herzl, metaphorically speaking? Is it the case that the dominant character here is Herzl, the fiercely secular, very modern Jewish politician who is interested not in religious tradition for its own sake, but interested in essentially using it as a vehicle for promoting a vision of a modern secular state? Or is the primary figure here Moses, which is to say the thrust of the Jewish tradition projecting to a messianic future where the Jewish people is once again back in its own land, and the Jewish tradition is simply using the vehicle of modern politics to achieve its own goal? And so the question of who is the primary figure in this Moses-Herzl partnership is an ambiguity in the heart of the Zionist movement, and it's also a source of tremendous controversy in the Zionist movement as a whole. And of course, different groups and individuals and personalities in Zionist history have prioritized one or another of this partnership in the way that they envision how the Jewish state, the state of Israel, should be. At the heart of the work that I write in this particular book, I'm dealing with the question of what in Hebrew is called Medinat Halacha, in English, a halachic state. And I want to briefly define what I mean by a halachic state. A halachic state is not the same as a state with some involvement of Jewishness or with Jewish religion in the state. It is not the same as a state in which Jewish religion has some kind of cultural place, or in which Jewish religious practice or law is is recognized in some way or is tolerated in some way. A halachic state is something a lot more specific. A halachic state is a state in which the law of the state, the law that is implemented in its courts, the law by which lawyers argue and prosecute people and acquit people, the law that police officers learn when they're deciding whether to arrest somebody or not, the law of the state is halakha, is traditional Jewish law. And in the case of almost all, in fact, all of the people that I'm going to talk about today, when they talk about halakha, they mean orthodox, traditional, orthodox halakha. Of course, I'm saying this because I don't want you to mistake me for thinking that the only kind of halakha there is orthodox halakha, which is clearly not the case, but for the people that I'm talking about, that is largely the case. The fact is that there are all kinds of people today in the state of Israel who believe that the state of Israel should, as a matter of principle, be run by halakha. And so there are all kinds of figures that come to mind when I bring up an ideology like this. So here is Bezalel Smotrich, who is certainly an increasingly popular and powerful figure on the Israeli right, the Israeli far right. And here is a quotation from him barely a year ago, when he was still, or believed himself at least to be a contender to be the Minister of Justice in one of the, I think, 42 elections that were held that year for the government of Israel. So here's Bezalel Smotrich calling explicitly for a halachic state. As he says, he wants the justice portfolio, he wants to be Minister of Justice because he wants to restore the Torah's justice system. He says, I think the Torah's monetary laws are much better than ours. In other words, much better than the laws that the Knesset legislated and the laws by which the state of Israel operates. We need to grant the rabbinical courts higher status. And when someone asks him, are you talking about a halachic state? He says, sure I am. And the Torah laws are far better than, quote, the halachic state founded by Aharon Barak. And here is a very familiar kind of slight from the religious far right, and actually not even the religious, often also the secular far right, which kind of criticizes the largely liberal-leaning court of Aharon Barak in the 90s and early 2000s for sort of legislating from the bench, as they will put it. So when people think of the term halachic state, it's often people like Bezalel Smotrich that they think of. And here is an image of a religious Zionist with a kippah sruga and very keen supporter of the settlement movement, had said many, at best, controversial things about Palestinian Israelis and Palestinians in general, and somebody who's like really on that side of the spectrum. But the thrust of what I want to talk to you about today is that even though today people like Bezalel Smotrich may be the people that we first think of when we say the words halachic state, actually the ideology of the halachic state is a lot older than Bezalel Smotrich and actually goes back to the 1940s. So what I want to do today is to talk about where the idea of the halachic state came from, why it is that it emerged when it did. I want to also tell you that even from within the religious context by which the rabbis, the proponents of the halachic state operate, even from within that ideology, there are religious alternatives to halachic state thinking that may be helpful for our thinking today in the context of the contemporary state of Israel. And I also want to show you some contemporary consequences of the history that I'm telling. In other words, this isn't just sort of historical interest, but it has tremendous consequences for the way the state of Israel is run today. So as I start talking to you about how the far right is not really the only place or even the original place where the ideology of the halachic state comes in, I want to sort of start moving backwards in history to talk about where this idea came from. So even if we go 10 years back, I'm sure many of you remember this, the Yaakov Ne'eman, who was Minister of Justice at the time, talked about bringing the law of the Torah and enforcing the halacha as the law of the state of Israel. Now, Yaakov Ne'eman certainly identifies as a religious man, but was not somebody identified with the extreme right. In many ways, politically speaking, he was seen to be a pretty gentle and well-respected figure. And I must say that there was a tremendous uproar after he made this statement, and he sort of, quote, clarified the statement, oh, that wasn't what I meant at all. And, you know, it could be that he meant it in the moment or didn't mean it and slip of the tongue, whatever it was. But these ideas I'm showing you are circulating, and not only in the far right, but also in sort of more mainstream and the more kind of humane aspects, the more gentle circles of Israeli religious life. And this was observed already in the 1970s by people like Shulamit Aloni, who of course is a politician from the left wing of the spectrum and a self-defined Chilonit, self-defined secular Israeli politician, who wrote in her book Hesder in 1970 that she was very, very concerned about
we seem to have an audio problem. Alex, can you hear me?
I think his yeah, screen froze.
Yeah. Well, let's wait a minute. I'm sure he'll overcome. In the meantime, let me just say that I missed seeing that the chair of our J-Plan, the Jewish Pluralism Legal Action Network, is with us as well, Peter Buxbaum. And as I said, it's wonderful to have the actual key players of the organization.
Hello, I'm so sorry. I suffered some kind of fatal technical glitch. Am I back and visible again?
Yeah.
Yes, you are.
Okay. My apologies. Let's hope that doesn't happen again. So let me just share this screen with you once again. Can I just pick right up from where I left off and go ahead? Okay, so the point I was trying to make is that already in the 70s, these tendencies, these trends were being observed. Now, the question then we have to ask ourselves is why? What is the cause of this ideology? Where did it come from? Now, I think if you ask many people, you'll get one of three answers. And if we had many hours to talk about this, we could talk about these in more detail. But I'm just going to tell you them briefly, and here they are. One of the answers is that there seems to have been an increase in interest in this phenomenon with the rise of the settlement movement in the early 70s and a kind of increasing prominence of religious Zionism in Israeli political life, Israeli military life, and so on. And there was a kind of triumphalism that carried up this sense of the importance of a halachic state. That's one source of the origins for this idea. Another is the ascension of the Israeli political right, particularly the election of Menachem Begin, who of course was a lot more sympathetic to religion in political life than any of his predecessors, and was closely aligned not just with the settlement movement, but also with an interest in an increased prominence of an orthodox feeling, we could say, to Israeli political life in general. And finally, another possible cause for the interest in the Medinat Halacha idea is the rise of Israeli ultra-Orthodoxy. And when I talk about Israeli ultra-Orthodoxy, there are many strands of this phenomenon. Of course, there are Ashkenazic strands of different kind, and also incredibly important are many Sephardic and Mizrahi strands, including perhaps especially the rise of the importance of Chacham Ovadia Yosef, and the increasing central role of the Shas party as a player in Israeli politics, from time to time a coalition maker, and certainly from the 80s onwards, a more and more prominent player in Israeli state institutions. Now, all of these sources for the rise of the idea of the halachic state are real, and anybody who says, yes, it comes from there, I don't disagree with them. But the argument that I make in my book, and I'm going to give you a brief outline of it today, is that actually the origin of the ideology of the halachic state is very much older than the 70s or the 80s. And its origins are from the end of the 1940s and the beginning of the 1950s. Or to put it differently, its origins are bound up with the ideology of religious Zionism right from the beginning of the period of the state. Now, this is a surprise to many Israelis when I talk about my research, because the tendency is for people that know Israeli political life and the history of Israeli politics and religion, the tendency is to think about religious Zionism in the 40s and 50s and 60s as kind of benign and quiet and not particularly powerful or bolshy, but just kind of going along with the largely left-wing political mainstream, and that something changes in the 70s where religious Zionism becomes a lot more assertive and powerful and uncompromising. And to a certain degree, that picture is accurate. But when it comes to this particular sense of the ideology of the halachic state, I argue that it finds its origins right there in the end of the 40s and the beginning of the 50s. Now, in some senses, this creates a rather bleak picture, which is to say, if I'm arguing that this kind of theocratic philosophy goes back right to the beginning of the state, is there any way to find a more pluralistic possibility that religious Zionists in Israel might be interested in accepting? And the argument that I want to make is that even though the ideology of the halachic state is very old, there is indeed an alternative from within the religious Zionist tradition that I think should be attractive to people who are interested today in the question of religious pluralism. So let me tell you what that alternative is. Here is Shlomo Goren. Shlomo Goren was the chief rabbi of Israel, Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Israel. Earlier in his career, he was the first chief, the head of the rabbinate of Tzahal, of the IDF. And I have here a quotation from an article, actually a series of articles that he wrote in 1948-9, when he wasn't even called Goren yet. He was called Goronchik still. It was before he kind of Israelized his last name. And let me, the articles that he wrote were trying to figure out what he, as an Orthodox religious Zionist rabbi, thought should be the place of Jewish law in the state of Israel. What should the place of Jewish law be in the state of Israel for Shlomo Goronchik at the time? And here is the idea that he came along with. He thought that there should, quote, be a dual system of courts. He imagined two parallel court systems. As he puts it, one of the court systems should be a rabbinical court system, which should operate according to halacha, and another system would be a civil court system, which would operate according to the laws that the secular, democratically elected Knesset would legislate. Now, why did he think it was important to have these two strands, these two lines, this dual system of courts? He obviously was very interested in halacha. He was an Orthodox rabbi. He believed halacha was the way that he wanted his life to be run. But he also recognized that the state of Israel had lots of people in it who were not Orthodox and who did not want to be ruled by halakha. He recognized that halakha was discriminatory. It distinguishes between men and women. It distinguishes between Jews and non-Jews. It has all kinds of archaisms in it because it's a very old system of law which does not really deal, or hadn't until this point, dealt with the problems of a modern and technologically advanced nation state. And so there were problems with just having halakha as the only law, however much in theory he may have wanted it to be the case. But so his solution was, let's have a dual court system. Let's have one system that if people want to go to rabbinical courts, they can, and if people want to go to secular courts, they can. In other words, here we have a rabbi, an Orthodox rabbi who, despite being one of the key leaders of the religious Zionist movement, was not interested in imposing halakha on all of the people in the state of Israel. Now, you may think that this sounds bizarre, that somebody with his pedigree, with his background, could explicitly talk in pluralistic terms about the law of the state of Israel. You may think this is odd. But I'm here to assure you that the reason we think it's odd is only because it became odd around that time, and because an alternative narrative has become so prominent in the intervening 70 years, most people, even sort of knowledgeable Jewish people, forget that there was this alternative that was around beforehand. And actually, if you are Shlomo Goronchik in 1948, this idea of two court systems, of a legally pluralistic state, is actually not so crazy. In fact, in many ways, it is the norm of Jewish life throughout the ages. Now, a brief overview of what I mean by that, and I'm happy to answer questions about it, is to say the following thing. For almost all communities, in almost all places, in almost all of Jewish history, Jews governed themselves as a matter of principle in a legally pluralistic way. That is to say, they believed that the system of halakha was a very important and central aspect of their lives, which was legally binding upon them, but they simultaneously recognized the binding authority of many other kinds of law at the same time. For example, Dina de Malchuta, the law of the state in which they lived, was a binding law upon them. It's not binding on them because they have an army and we don't. It's binding on them because from within their own religious worldview, as a matter of principle, the law of the state is binding. Similarly, Jewish communities in all kinds of contexts, historically and geographically, had, alongside the rabbinical courts in their communities, they also had courts that were made up not of rabbis, but of lay people who wrote laws which were not halachic laws and judged people according to these laws which were not halachic. These were called takanot hakahal, which are non-halachic legislation. And again, Jewish communities, across a tremendous diversity, both geographically and chronologically, understood that a legally pluralistic approach to things was the norm, if you like. So this is where Goren is coming from. It's not a radical idea. It's a pretty straightforward idea. Now, why then was that position rejected in favor of a more centralized and uncompromising single ideology of having halakha as the exclusive system of law in the state, to the exclusion of all others? This shift, and it was a shift, a major shift, came about at the end of the 40s and the beginning of the 50s, and it was motivated by various people, including Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Halevi Herzog, the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of the state of Israel, who was previously the chief rabbi of Palestine, and before he came to the Mandate Palestine, he was the chief rabbi of Ireland. He wrote, and I put some quotations of his on the slide here, it's inconceivable that there should be two parallel authorities in the state of Israel. In other words, Goren's idea of pluralism is inconceivable. Now, was it inconceivable? No, it was completely conceivable. Goren had conceived of it. And in fact, it was the norm of most Jewish communities in most of history. So, but there was something about it that bothered him, that he didn't like, that he was pushing against. As he wrote, certainly rhetorically rather than literally, but still with a good amount of punch here, we will not give up on the law of the Torah. I am ready to sacrifice my life for it. Similarly, it's around the same time, Meir Berlin, Bar Ilan, said that his goal is to create a law for the state of Israel based on the Torah in all fields of the life of the state, this law and no other, none besides it. And here is a photograph that I found in the archive, which I don't know, I hope you can see the detail. I'm worried that you won't because it's quite small. But this is a photograph from the founding, from the cornerstone, the time that the cornerstone was laid for the building that is now called Heichal Shlomo in the center of Jerusalem. And if you can see, it's probably too small to see that both Ashkenazic and Sephardic chief rabbis, Herzog and Uziel, are present. And in the background, you can see these sort of banners that they have put up saying, Torah achat u'mishpat echad yeh lachem. You should have one law in the state. These are, of course, quotations from the Bible. Tzion b'mishpat tipadeh. Zion will be redeemed through mishpat, law, by which they meant halacha. Emet u'mishpat shalom shektuv b'sha'archem. You should pursue, you should judge with the mishpat shalom, the law of peace, by which again they meant halacha. They were absolutely fixated on this idea that there should be a single law in Israel, which was a halachic law. So how do we get from the picture of Goren on the one hand, the pluralism of Goren, and I should say, I'm choosing Goren as an example, but in my book I have several other examples of important religious thinkers who adopted the same legally pluralistic attitude as Goren had pursued. So how do we get from that legally pluralistic position to this exclusive halachic state at all costs position? Or in other words, how did this happen? Now, here we get into some more interesting sort of a wider field of history, a wider European history. I'm going to give you the outline of this history now because I want to finish leaving a good 10 or if possible 15 minutes for questions at the end. So I'm going to give you the outlines of this now. Of course, we can talk about it more in the question time. My book has a lot more detail, and feel free to contact me at any time if you're interested in more about this. But this is my thesis of how this shift from legal pluralism to legal centralism to the idea of the halachic state occurred. Now, you may be wondering, why am I showing you a picture from Charles Dickens on the screen right now? And the reason that I'm doing that is because of a deep irony in the position of, in the ideology of the halachic state. And here is the irony. People like Herzog, Bar Ilan, Uziel, and others like them who founded the idea of the halachic state talked about this idea as a grand rejection of what they called foreign laws, by which they meant modern European-style legal codes. They said, you secular leaders of Israel, like Ben-Gurion, want to import all of this foreign nonsense, whereas actually we, the Jews, have this ancient, perfect, divine law, which should be the law of the state. So they posed the idea of the halachic state as a rejection of modern legal thought. The irony is, in fact, that the very idea of the halachic state is itself not a rejection of modern legal thought, but an example of modern legal thought. It came about only because the people that came up with the ideology of the halachic state were so deeply influenced by modern legal ideas. And let me tell you briefly how that works. Before the 19th century, all states, I'm generalizing somewhat, but this is largely true, all states were governed in a legally pluralistic way. So if you have, for example, England in the middle of the 19th century, there are the courts of equity, and there are the courts of chancery, and there is common law, and there is mercantile law, and there is canon law, and there is law that comes from all kinds of guilds from the Middle Ages. There's this whole jumble of laws that governs England. There is no single streamlined, unified, hierarchical legal system in England. And the reason I'm putting Dickens on the screen is because Dickens' book Bleak House is in a way a parody of is ridiculing this system, which at the time was seen to be, by the end of the 19th century, was seen to be very, very convoluted and backward and not fitting of a modern state where people should prioritize things like efficiency and technology and so on. And as a result, things actually began to change. They actually changed a little bit earlier, right from the beginning of the 19th century in France, when Napoleon brought in the Code Civil in the end of the 18th, the beginning of the 19th century. And this kind of ushered in a series of legal reforms in Europe that continued through the 19th century. Here is the Bürgerliches Gesetzbuch of Germany, which was the first edition was in 1896. And these are both examples of new civil codes that were brought into states that previously were governed by a whole hodgepodge, a jumble of different legal systems that by the end of the 19th century were streamlined into a single system of law. And England was no exception. There was a whole series of Victorian legal reforms that took place at the end of the 19th century that did exactly the same thing. Now, people like Isaac Herzog, who had been brought up in England, he'd studied in France, he'd been chief rabbi in Ireland, had observed all of this going on, and had, in the course of, I mean, I'm focusing on Herzog right now, but I could just as easily talk about some of the other characters, but let me talk about Herzog for a moment. In his career, he spent a lot of time talking about Jewish law and how wonderful it is to lots of different audiences. And he knew, he maybe even knew so deep that it was almost unconscious. He knew that for modern legal thinkers, a system of law that is pluralistic, that recognizes different legal systems alongside each other, was seen by people like Dickens and many other critics as something that was backward and old-fashioned and inefficient and under-evolved. That a legal system that was the pinnacle of evolution, as they thought about it at the time, had to be this unified, streamlined, efficient system. So much so that Herzog and people like him made the argument that halakha itself was such a system, was a system that was not pluralistic at all, or was exclusively just a single system of law. So I'm going to skip this slide for now and skip to the question of contemporary consequences. So again, I've gone over this rather briefly, but the headlines are exactly as I've outlined, that the idea of the halachic state is not an ancient Jewish idea at all. In fact, in most Jewish communities for most of history, legal pluralism was the normal way of thinking about law. The idea of the halachic state came in at the end of the 1940s and the beginning of the 1950s. And it was, although it was ushered in by people who call it a rejection of modern secular law, in fact, it was based upon the very same principles as modern European secular law that had come about as a result of various legal reforms at the end of the 19th century and into the beginning of the 20th century. Again, there are many more details here, and I don't be mistaken into thinking that, let me say it this way, I don't claim to have convinced you of this fact. I have merely stated this fact. The evidence for it, we can talk about more in the questions if you'd like me to kind of back this up with explanation and evidence. But what does this mean today? If you look in the rhetoric of religious figures in Israel today, you will find that it has been taken over almost entirely by the idea of the halachic state as it became crystallized in the early 50s. In other words, the pluralism of people like Goren at the time is almost entirely forgotten. And it's basically taken for granted that as a matter of principle, if you are a religious leader in Israel, you want ideally to have a halachic state, to have halakha run the state of Israel. Now, within that very generalized statement, there is a tremendous spectrum of ideas, all the way from people who would say, yeah, I think that as a matter of principle, but obviously I have to weigh it up with other priorities and values that I have. And there are many religious thinkers who would say, yes, I think that is a value, but so is democracy, so is pluralism, so is tolerance. These are also values, and I have to weigh up all these values with each other and come up with a more pluralistic perspective. All the way to the other end of the spectrum, where we have religious thinkers saying, tear the whole thing down, halakha has to be the law, otherwise we want to destroy everything. Now, if you want to see some examples of this, I want to recommend to you this little book by Yair Sheleg, that was put out about a decade ago. It's part of a series from the Israel Democracy Institute. Yair Sheleg, a writer, journalist, went around and interviewed many religious Zionist thinkers in the state of Israel, asking them about what they think about these questions. And what he found was that there was barely a single one who didn't, in somewhere within themselves, think that as a matter of principle, halakha should be the law of the state. But of course, there was, as I said again, a tremendous spectrum of opinion within there, all the way from relatively tolerant, open organizations like Eretz Chemda, which is a yeshiva that has set up a kind of network of batei din, of religious courts in Israel, and wants to kind of encourage people to use them as opposed to the secular courts of the state. But they're not using any kind of violent rhetoric. They're using kind of the tools of persuasion and to try and encourage Israeli Jews to use rabbinical courts as opposed to secular courts. But we also have people like Yitzchak Ginsburg, who, although more a Haredi rabbi than a religious Zionist rabbi, is very influential among religious Zionists, who makes this argument. He wants to overthrow the government and overthrow the next government and so on and so forth until the rule of Torah is established in the land. I think it's reasonable to say that these are not pluralistic values that he is espousing in this slide. Now, I'm going to end here with one final word and then stop for questions, because I want to make one position pretty clear, because it's easy to sort of misunderstand the historical work I've done to come to a conclusion that I don't want to come to. And that is this. In a way, it's always true that the easiest position to hold in your head is an extreme position, okay, is an uncompromising position. So it's easy to say, those religious people are crazy. They want a theocracy, and they want to destroy democracy. They want to oppress people that don't want to follow their laws. They don't even like other religious people who are not Orthodox, and they want to get rid of them. And that this has to be stopped at all costs. Now, there are certainly some personalities and institutions who, I think it is true, are most certainly coercive and violent in their rhetoric or in their actions. And one must certainly be entirely uncompromising when it comes to their position. However, I would say the following thing. The question of the relationship between religion and state is not an easy question. No democracy in the world has come up with a formula that somehow is a magic spell that balances the freedoms of people and protecting their sensibilities, whether they be religious or secular, the values that they hold most deeply, balancing that with a sense of tolerance and pluralism in democratic society. There is no formula that in any context will just say, oh, here's how you do it. You allow this, you don't allow this. It's not possible. The reason it's not possible is because there is no exact answer to this. Different states in different contexts need to figure this out using careful advocacy, openness, conversation, an open attitude, and so on. So I'm not somebody who's saying all of those religious people are crazy and have to be stopped at all costs. But what I am saying is the following thing. There is something, there is a predominant ideology among many religious leaders in Israel today that is, in essence, non-pluralistic. That is, in essence, wanting an exclusive halachic law for the whole state. There is, by the way, also among many secular Israelis a similarly, almost a mirror image, uncompromising exclusivist ideology that said at all costs there has to be secular law with no compromise of any other kind. What I'm saying is there is no easy way to thread the needle, but if there is going to be any way of doing that, we need some kind of subtlety in our conversation. And what I am trying to contribute here is to say that even for those people who are inside of a religious ideology, of course there are many people who are not, who do not have a religious ideology and don't want a religious ideology, which is fine. But I'm showing that even for people who are within a religious ideology, for whom the Jewish tradition and the Jewish halachic tradition are extremely important and central to their lives, even for them, there are these endless resources going back centuries and centuries that were even espoused by religious Zionist leaders like Shlomo Goren, that were pluralistic values within the religious tradition. This is not some kind of imposition from liberal ideology. This is something which is baked in to the religious Jewish tradition. So I'm not saying this is, I'll snap my fingers and just show all religious Zionists Shlomo Goren and then they'll say, oh, great, let's all be pluralistic. I'm not so naive as to say that. But I do hope that in some small way, bringing to greater light this history and the development and the origins of the halachic state idea will make it easier to have conversations that will allow for as great an extent as possible of tolerance and pluralism and of the ability of people to speak to each other and to come to legal and political solutions that are maximally good for the most amount of people. So thank you for listening. I'm going to now end the sort of formal part of what I have to say, and we have about 10 minutes left. And Uri, please let me know what questions you'd like me to answer.
Sure. So we have a number of interesting comments that were written during your presentation and a number of questions. So let's start with Goren. And the question is, how developed was Goren's thinking? What did he actually think about the rougher edges, such as who is everybody able to choose which system to go to? What happens if one wants to go to the religious system and one wants to go to the secular system?
Yeah.
And he says it cannot contravene Torah law.
Yes.
But what happens when some religious authority says, well, everything contravenes Torah law, or what you think doesn't contravene actually does contravene? So who has the upper hand?
Yeah.
How did Goren deal with potential conflicts? And connected with that, you refer to him in some way as pluralistic. Is that serious? I mean, we understand pluralism today in a certain sense. Was he really pluralistic?
Great. Thank you for the opportunity to sort of expand on this a little bit. First point, when I am using the term pluralism in regard to Goren, I'm using it as a technical term, and what I mean is legal pluralism. So legal pluralism is a term that comes from the field of jurisprudence. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but just for those who are not, this is not the same as philosophical pluralism, religious pluralism. It doesn't mean that he thinks that everyone's truth is the same or there is no one truth. It's specifically a legal pluralism, and what legal pluralism means is that there is an acceptance that there are different sources of legal authority within the same polity. Okay, so I do not think that he was a pluralist in the sense of like a fundamental liberal value of pluralism and accepting that everyone has their own truths and so on. I don't think that's the case. If anything, he was a pragmatist when it came to those areas in many ways. But he was, at this stage in his life at any rate, a legal pluralist. So I'm not making any greater claims for his religious pluralism. Unfortunately, he did write a series of articles on this legally pluralistic idea, but he doesn't spell it out. He doesn't pad out all of the details to the degree that we really would love to see. He does acknowledge that these are questions that have to be dealt with, and he kind of feints at solving some of these problems, but he acknowledges that he's not solving all of them. And I would say that in some ways it's a casualty of history that his ideas were not taken up. Had they been taken up, maybe there would have been more, there would have had to be more working through the details. One final point on that is that when it comes to legal pluralism in general, in all countries and times in history where there have been more than one legal system operating at the same time, there are always these questions of who wins out in a case of conflict. In other words, this wouldn't be a question distinct to this particular instance of Shlomo Goren's idea of the state of Israel. That's a general question for legal pluralism in general. And so I also, I am not advocating, I'm not somebody that says, you want to solve the whole problem of religion and state in Israel, go and read these 3 articles by Shlomo Goren, and that will spell out everything you need to know. That's not the claim I'm making. I certainly don't think he solved all the problems, but I am saying that there is this strand of thought within religious Zionism that was at least open to a relationship between religion and state in Israel that was not a halachic state idea where only halacha as a matter of principle can have any authority.
But still with Goren, and then we'll move on. So does his writing include resolution of conflicts? And if so, how? Given that he says that the secular system cannot contravene Torah law.
Yes. So first of all, when he says the secular system cannot contravene Torah law, what he means by that is, nobody can say, there can't be a Knesset law that says everybody has to drive on Shabbat or something like that. Everyone has to eat pork now. I don't think he is not thinking about, what if halacha has a certain law regarding, let's say, contracts, and the state has a different law regarding contracts. He would accept that tension or that difference, I think. When it comes to conflict, he said that this is a possible way out, but he did not say this was a necessary solution. His solution was, if there is a conflict between 2 parties about which court to go to, if both parties were Jewish, the default in case of conflict would be the rabbinical courts, and if one of the parties was not Jewish, the default would be the civil courts. But again, he left open, even as he was saying that solution, that there might be other ways to go about doing this. This is by stark contrast, by the way, to people like Herzog and Bar Ilan, who literally set up committees that wrote books. Their goal was to have, if you go into a law library, you have the codes on the shelf. That's the books that you pick up to say what is the law of the state. They wanted to produce, and they began to produce. They published the beginnings of a law library that they imagined would be the law of Israel, not in matters of ritual law like kashrut, Shabbat, but in civil law, but also in criminal law, in all kinds of areas of law. They began to produce these legal codes, and they thought that all the judges in Israel would be given this law to study, whether they were Jewish or not, whether they were men or women. So you could have female judges, Muslim judges, whoever it is, using this law for the law of Israel, whoever it would be, but they needed to have the halachic law as the state of Israel. And that's very different from Goren's position.
So we'll move on to a few other questions that refer to, I think, primarily those who would like to see Israel governed by Torah law. So one is sort of a segue from the last point that you made, namely back to Herzog. You say he wanted these books to be in the hands of judges, whether Jewish or not Jewish, etc. But the point is, he was very clear, vocal, and explicit that the courts, the civil courts, with Jewish judges were illegitimate, and Jews should not come to judgment before. So how did he reconcile his aversion, overt aversion, to the legitimacy of civil courts and what you're saying, sort of a gentle approach, if only they read the books, things may be fine.
Yes.
Moving, just connected with it.
Yes.
So there were a number of questions as to, did they seriously think that Torah law could address all the modern questions? How? And
Yes.
if it needed to be updated, how would it be updated? And since it was clear that there was a secular legislator, how do they reconcile the secular legislator in terms of Torah law?
Excellent. Okay, good. So, and let me just think which is the best order to take those in. Okay, I'm going to take them in the reverse. So, it's interesting that even though the halachic state position of people like Herzog seems to be the more uncompromising one, actually, when it comes to halachic reasoning, it is the most radical one. It is the most innovative one, the one that has the most tension with tradition. Why is that? Because for Goren, he says there's these two systems of law. So he knows that the state of Israel has to be a democratic state. That was a foregone conclusion. So what do we do with this, the fact that the halakha has distinctions between men and women, Jews and non-Jews? So Goren would say, if that's a problem for you, go to the civil court system track. And if you don't, then go to the rabbinical court system track. In other words, it's another kind of irony that the pluralistic position actually allows for a greater traditionalism within the halachic strand of the pluralistic position. If you want to say that everything has to be halachic, you then have to contend with the questions that you just asked. How do you deal with gender difference? How do you deal with people from different religious communities? How do you deal with technology? How do you deal with the laws of an army? How do you deal with laws of elections? How do you deal with any of these things that halakha hasn't seriously dealt with? So people like Herzog, who wanted halakha to be the law of the state, were the very people that were actually more willing to be radical in their, maybe the word radical is too strong, but certainly innovative in their interpretation of halakha than people who were more pluralistic, ironically. Now, there are all kinds of strategies that Herzog used to allow for women to be judges, for non-Jews to be judges, and he did. He absolutely believed that this could and should be the case in Israel. He wasn't necessarily gung-ho about it as a solid liberal, but he absolutely recognized that this had to be the case, and he set about using innovative halachic interpretation to do it, and which in the book I write about in great length. There's not time right now to talk about the techniques that he used, but I'm very happy to talk about it with any of you at a different time. Right. So that's the first point. The second question, or the first question you asked, my second answer is to understand something important. The idea of the halachic state that Herzog had failed. It failed. The idea that he said, I'm ready to defend, to sacrifice my life over it, the law books that he was producing for every lawyer and judge in the state of Israel to use, it failed. The state of Israel became a secular democracy. The laws of the Knesset are the laws of the Knesset. Even the religious courts in Israel, which do have jurisdiction in certain areas of law and personal status law, are, from the perspective of the state, from the perspective of Bagatz, under the control of the state. Bagatz has said it a number of times that the religious courts only have authority because the state gives them that authority to have jurisdiction in those areas and could theoretically take it away. It's unlikely to happen right now, but theoretically. So it failed. So how did Herzog and his whole crew deal with that failure? And the answer is basically twofold. Number one, they did not give up on the principle of the halachic state as an ideal, but they were pragmatists. And they then set about through the 50s and 60s, and we see all kinds of writings, people like Shaul Yisraeli, Chaim David Halevi, very innovative, very thoughtful halachic interpreters, set about creating a system of halachic interpretation that was kind of accepting of the fact that there were these secular courts in Israel. They didn't embrace them, they didn't say this is the best thing since sliced bread, but they did say we can tolerate this or that or the other aspects of them. And those techniques of acceptance are still in operation today. Many religious Zionist thinkers today in Israel will still say the same things about the civil courts. Not ideal, perhaps. They maybe shouldn't have jurisdiction in all areas, but there are these ways that we can tolerate or accept them. But there are others who kind of reject those techniques of acceptance and toleration, and that's what comes out with the more uncompromising position that has the principle of the theocratic state without all of the innovative interpretation that allows it to be more accepting and tolerant.
Well, there are a number of additional questions, but I think that we have certainly been treated to an overview of the foundations and the sort of leading to the contemporary dilemmas and battles that are still evolving and still very relevant. I urge those who have not been answered and feel that we should be dealing more with any of the issues that you raised or related issues, please write us. We would love to hear from you and provide either another opportunity to hear about those issues or else try and provide some more answers in writing. Just to sort of put it still in a contemporary context, you presented the slide of the late Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, and the translation was "Vote for Shas, go to heaven." Like in a monopoly game, you know, whatever it's called, that ticket, get out of jail. Actually, I'm suggesting that there is a more manipulative context here, because that particular banner appeared only once. I mean, many such banners, but in one of the 3 election campaigns that took place in the last, year and a half. And the one that it appeared in was the September elections. This isn't just about go to heaven. This is an extremely manipulative and probably on the verge of illegal abuse of the faith in the powers of Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. Namely, we are nearing Yom Kippur. Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, this great rabbinic force, is in heaven. You vote for Shas here, and he'll work out your legal ordeal in the coming Yom Kippur in heaven. Namely, vote for Shas, and it's not about going to heaven, it's about resolving your sins in the upcoming day of trial in Yom Kippur. It doesn't work on everybody, but there is a whole lot of people in Israel for whom this is an extremely appealing proposition. If all I need to do is vote for Shas, well, that's a good deal. And as it so happens, last week in the Shas weekly newspaper, they chose to quote in the Torah section that relates to and presents Ovadia Yosef's halachic thought. They chose to include a section in which Rabbi Ovadia Yosef is saying secular Israeli courts are illegitimate, Jews may not come to judgment before, they are invalid. So this isn't just about the 40s and the 50s, it isn't about the 60s, it isn't just about Smotrich and Ne'eman. This is happening, this is unfolding, this is taking on different shapes these very days, literally. So with that, actually stay tuned to Chidush newsletters, because this Thursday, the Supreme Court is going to entertain a case that's very much along the lines that you alluded to at the end, namely the clash between the rabbinic courts and the civil court system. And as so often is the case, the women who happen to be adjudicated and the rights decided by the rabbinic courts are getting the short side of the stick. And the Supreme Court, in a supervisory capacity, is now called upon to decide whether the rabbinic court approach was within keeping with the Israeli legal requirements. It's much more complicated than that. Stay tuned, watch for the Thursday Supreme Court hearing, and we'll try and share with you the upshot of what transpires there. Professor Kaye, you have been wonderful. I'm sure that many will have an interest in your book on the invention of theocracy. It certainly is both intellectually stimulating and relevant for those who want to understand, you know, how this has all happened, as you titled it, and where is it taking us. Stay tuned. In 2 weeks, Professor Ruth Halpin Kadari, a jurist, the head of the Reckman Center on Women and COVID-19 Pandemic, Law, Religion, State, and Politics. And in a month, on August 13th, a fantastic panel, Rabbi Asher Lopatin, Rabbi Daniel Landis, Daphne Price, and Rabbi Avram Milotek on the unfolding renewal, possibly revolution, offered by modern Orthodoxy in Israel and in the US. Thank you all. Shalom.
Ori, before you
Yes,
sign off, I just want to thank you and let you know that Rabbi Dick Hirsch is in your audience today.
Ah, wonderful. Well, I probably didn't do justice in not noticing a number of people. Dick Hirsch, a good friend and former president for many, many years of the World Union for Progressive Judaism, and in many ways responsible for the growth of Reform Judaism in Israel. So thank you, Ron. Thank you, Dick. Thank you, Alex Kaye, and to all of you. We'll meet hopefully in 2 weeks, August 17th at noon New York time. Shalom and leitraot.